One common problem students have when they're printing is they will get a bleed in their screen. And what a bleed is when you load too much ink into the stencil, right? So when you do a flood stroke, you're pushing ink through the openings in the stencil, and that's the ink that's really going to be printing on the paper. If you go over the stencil too many times, too many flood strokes back and forth, or if you have your squeegee at the wrong angle, those are kind of the most common reasons why people get an ink. What you're doing is you're pushing more ink through there than is necessary. And so when you have more ink in the stencil than you need in that area, it's actually going to spread out underneath, and that's what a bleed is. So what I've done is I've gone over the surface of this image several times back and forth to try to create a bleed so you can see that happen. In terms of the angle of the squeegee, you want it about at a 45-degree angle, something like this. You want it sitting just on the corner of that square edge, right? Typically, students print too flat, and so they have the squeegee down like this, and that will cause a bleed too, right? If it's too straight up and down, it's not going to print well. If it's too flat, it's not going to print well. It's going to take a little bit of time to get a feel for what the right angle is. Okay? So I'm going to put a piece of newsprint under here. If you look close, you can see what that image looks like, right? Mm-hmm. And so now when I print this, by comparison, we'll see if this actually bleeds. Oh yes, it bleeds quite a lot. That's a bleed. That's a very, very obvious bleed, right? If you look over here, this part of the image had an ink bleed, but the rest didn't. That means there was probably too much ink here. Maybe when they did a flood stroke, they went back over a little bit and it loaded up too much ink. Or maybe as they did a flood stroke, their angle of the squeegee got more flat as it moved this way, and that caused the bleed. So how do we fix it? Okay. First, when we know we have a bleed, we don't want to flood ink back in there. We want to actually wipe the underside of the screen to try to get up any of that ink, right? Because if the ink is still wet under the screen, even if we flood the ink correctly the next time, it's going to pull that ink out, okay? Since this was such a large bleed, I'm going to take a sponge. When I'm working, I always have a bucket filled with water and a sponge, right? And I'm actually going to wipe the ink off the underside. There was a lot here, so using the sponge is important. Normally, I would just wipe it with the paper towel. Okay? I want to dry that area, so I'm going to use the paper towel again. And now, it should print well. Okay? When I flood stroke, I always flood stroke a nice thin layer where I can still see the stencil. Okay? Anytime you're not sure it's going to print well, always print on newsprint or some other paper other than your good paper. Okay? And so now when I go to print, I'll pull all that ink with me, keep the angle the same, and we're back to a clean, resolved image where there's no bleed.